Hey guys, tonight we're diving deep into the kind of history that practically begs you to close your eyes and drift off. Forget your epic battles and your grand speeches. We're talking about the long, winding, and utterly exhaustive tale of Hercules. Imagine, if you will, a vast, ancient landscape stretching out under a sky heavy with forgotten stars. You're trudging through the dusty plains of mythical Greece, the kind of place where every shadow seems to whisper forgotten names, and the very air hums with stories too old to stay awake for. You might even catch a faint whiff of olives and, well, something vaguely leonine, which probably means you won't survive this particular narrative if you're expecting thrilling adventure. This isn't a heart-pounding saga. It's more like a very thorough inventory of ancient woes. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story, or rather, your journey into the slumber-inducing annals of antiquity, begins not with the thunderous roar of a hero, but with the quiet, calculated deception of a god. You see, the mighty Zeus, king of the gods, had a bit of a roving eye. A major, persistent problem, really. He was quite taken with Alcmene, the wife of Amphitryon, a general from Thebes. Now, Alcmene was known for her exceptional beauty and virtue, which, naturally, made her an irresistible target for Zeus. To pull off his grand romantic heist, Zeus, ever the master of disguise, decided to impersonate Amphitryon himself. He knew Amphitryon was away at war, so, with impeccable timing and a little divine theatricality, he showed up at Alcmene's door, looking exactly like her husband. Not only that, but he also spun a convincing tale of his victorious return from battle, complete with a highly detailed, utterly fabricated account of his triumphs. He even managed to make the night last 3 times longer than normal, which, you have to admit, is an impressive feat of divine manipulation. You probably wouldn't notice the extra long sunset, but somewhere, a celestial clock was definitely getting confused. The result of this celestial subterfuge was the conception of a son, who would eventually be known as Hercules. But here's the rub. On the very same night, Alcmene's actual husband, Amphitryon, returned home, quite genuinely. And because the ancient world was just full of these delightful coincidences, he too spent the night with his wife. So, Alcmene became pregnant with twins, one son fathered by Zeus, and the other by Amphitryon. Talk about a complex family tree. This double conception is a mainstream historical fact in the mythological narrative, often cited as the root of much of Hercules' subsequent strife. The son of Zeus would be Alcaeus, later renamed Hercules, and the son of Amphitryon would be Iphicles. Historians still argue whether Alcmene herself ever truly suspected the divine deception, or if she simply found herself bewildered by the unusual timing of her pregnancies. It's a quirky tidbit to consider. Did she just think her husband was really enthusiastic after his trip, or did a tiny part of her wonder why he seemed to glow faintly in the dark? Now, Zeus, being Zeus, was immensely proud of his divine offspring. He boasted to all the other gods on Mount Olympus that a child was about to be born who would be a great ruler, descended from him, and that this child would hold sway over all those who lived around him. His jealous wife, Hera, however, was not amused. Not one bit. You can practically hear her sighing exasperatedly from across the pantheon. She knew full well about Zeus's philandering ways, and she absolutely detested the fruits of his illicit unions. Hera, in her boundless resentment, hatched a plan to thwart Zeus's prophecy. She tricked Zeus into swearing an oath that the child born that day, descended from his blood, would indeed be a great ruler. Once the oath was sworn, Hera quickly arranged for Eurystheus, another descendant of Zeus, to be born prematurely, before Hercules. She also delayed Hercules' birth, making sure that Eurystheus, a far weaker and less noble man, would be the one to fulfill the prophecy of ruling over others. The sheer pettiness of ancient gods, honestly, it's almost admirable in its dedication. Imagine going to such lengths just to spite someone's birth announcement. Thus, Eurystheus was born first, a scrawny, fearful individual, destined to become Hercules' eventual master. Hercules, meanwhile, finally arrived, a remarkably strong and robust infant, despite Hera's meddling. His original name, Alcaeus, meant Mighty One, a rather fitting moniker, even before his true strength began to manifest. Even as a tiny baby, his extraordinary nature was apparent. You're probably picturing a normal, squishy infant, but picture one with biceps. That's Hercules. This early divine interference, Hera's deliberate manipulation of birth order, set the stage for all the trials and tribulations that would define Hercules' life. It's almost as if the universe decided, right from the start, that this child wouldn't have a moment of peace. And as you imagine this cosmic interference, you might find your own eyelids growing heavy, mirroring the slow, deliberate pace of fate. Even in his infancy, Hercules was a magnet for divine drama, specifically Hera's relentless, utterly irrational animosity. You'd think a newborn would be safe, but no, not when you've got a goddess nursing a millennia-long grudge. One evening, as you might imagine the soft glow of oil lamps illuminating a peaceful nursery, Hera decided to make her move. She dispatched two enormous, venomous serpents to the twins' crib, slithering silently through the darkness, their scales shimmering with ill intent. Their mission was simple: coil around the infants and strangle them. It was a classic Hera move, really, always going for the dramatic, often lethal, solution to her marital woes. You can practically hear the subtle hiss as they entered the room, a sound designed to give even the bravest ancient Greek a serious case of the shivers. Now, Iphicles, being a perfectly normal baby, if there is such a thing in Greek mythology, reacted exactly as any sensible infant would. He screamed loudly. His little lungs worked overtime, bellowing a terrified protest. But Hercules? Oh no, Hercules was built differently. You're picturing a tiny, helpless bundle, right? Wrong. Instead of crying, baby Hercules, with the instincts of a seasoned wrestler, calmly reached out and grabbed one serpent in each hand. Imagine that. A baby, not even crawling yet, effortlessly gripping the writhing bodies of two deadly reptiles. And then, with a strength that defied all logic and biology, he squeezed. He squeezed with such incredible force that the serpents, despite their size and venom, were crushed to death. Their last, desperate thrashing against the side of the crib was all the sound their demise made, before silence, save for Iphicles' dwindling whimpers, fell over the room. This astonishing feat, crushing two snakes as a baby, is one of the foundational stories of Hercules' incredible power, firmly establishing him as more than just a mortal child. It's a widely known mythological detail, often depicted in ancient art. Amphitryon and Alcmene, awakened by Iphicles' screams, rushed into the nursery, expecting the worst. What they found, however, must have been utterly bewildering. Two dead serpents, one in each of baby Hercules' tiny, dimpled hands, and Hercules himself, calmly gurgling, perhaps even with a hint of satisfaction. It was a truly bizarre scene, something straight out of a particularly strange lullaby. Alcmene, of course, was filled with both terror and immense relief. Amphitryon, however, being a mortal man in a world full of meddling deities, understood instantly that this was no ordinary child. He realized that Hercules possessed divine parentage, and that his life would be fraught with peril, thanks to Hera's evident displeasure. You can almost feel Amphitryon's resigned sigh. Just another Tuesday when your kid strangles mythical beasts for fun. Historians still argue whether this incident was merely a divine warning from Hera or a genuine attempt on the child's life. Was she truly trying to kill him, or just send a very strong, serpentine-shaped message? After this rather dramatic infancy, Amphitryon, understanding the gravity of the situation and the immense power of his stepson, decided that Hercules needed the best possible education, not just in combat, but in the arts and sciences too. He hired a veritable who's who of mythical tutors. You had Linus, son of Apollo, teaching him music and playing the lyre. This, frankly, is where Hercules probably struggled the most. Imagine a muscle-bound demigod trying to delicately strum a lyre. It's like asking a bulldozer to perform surgery. The story goes that Hercules, in a moment of frustration, struck Linus with his lyre, killing him instantly. A rather unfortunate turn of events for Linus, who probably just wanted Hercules to hit the right notes. It's a quirky tidbit that shows even legendary heroes had anger management issues and a surprising lack of musical talent. You think he'd just break the strings, not the teacher. Then there was Eurydice, who taught him archery, and Autolycus, a son of Hermes, who was a master of wrestling and swordsmanship. You might recall Autolycus as the grandfather of Odysseus, a renowned trickster himself, so Hercules was getting lessons from the best, or at least the most cunning, in the business. And finally, there was Castor, one of the famous Dioscuri, who instructed him in horsemanship and charioteering. So, Hercules was getting the full package: music, which he failed spectacularly at, combat skills, and how to handle a chariot like a boss. It was a well-rounded education designed to prepare him for whatever challenges the gods, especially Hera, decided to throw his way. You can almost see him, a strapping young lad, going from one lesson to the next, flexing a little too much during the wrestling drills, and probably snapping a few too many bowstrings with his immense strength. The constant underlying tension, the shadow of Hera, always loomed, reminding everyone that this powerful young man was living on borrowed time, or at least on borrowed tranquility. This thorough upbringing in various disciplines is often highlighted as crucial to his development, making him not just strong, but also capable in a variety of situations. Despite his remarkable strength and burgeoning skill set, Hercules, even as a young man, couldn't quite shake the shadow of Hera's relentless spite. You might imagine a moment of calm, perhaps a peaceful afternoon of tending to his flocks, because yes, even demigods had chores. After accidentally killing Linus, his music tutor, Hercules was exiled to the countryside by Amphitryon, who, understandably, wanted to keep his super-strong stepson from accidentally redecorating anyone else with a lyre. It was during this period of pastoral exile, as he grew into full manhood, that he truly began to embody the raw, untamed power that would define him. You'd think a quiet life with sheep would be boring, but for Hercules, even sheep probably found themselves subtly intimidated. One day, while tending to these very flocks on Mount Cithaeron, an immense and rather aggressive lion began terrorizing the local shepherds and their herds. This wasn't just any lion. This was the Cithaeron lion, a beast of monstrous size and ferocity. You can almost hear the panic in the villagers' voices, the cries of their livestock, echoing through the valleys. Hercules, seeing the suffering of the people and the damage to their livelihoods, decided to take matters into his own hands, or rather, his very strong, bare hands. For 50 days, he hunted the beast, tracking it through the rugged terrain, sleeping rough, and probably smelling quite wild himself by the end of it. It's a good example of his early self-reliance, his willingness to face down a menace without any divine guidance or fancy weapons. He didn't just wait for the monster to come to him. He actively sought it out. Finally, he cornered the lion. Now, imagine yourself facing down a creature that large, claws the size of dinner plates, teeth like daggers. Most people would run, or at least bring a really, really big spear. But Hercules? He engaged the lion in hand-to-hand combat. A wrestling match, if you will, with a giant feline predator. And in a display of brutal, overwhelming strength, he ultimately strangled the beast to death. He then proceeded to skin the lion, using its incredibly tough hide as a cloak, the lion's head serving as a rather unique, terrifying helmet. This lion-skin cloak became one of his iconic symbols, a constant visual reminder of his unparalleled physical might. It's a mainstream historical fact in his legend that he wore this hide, setting a fashion trend that, mercifully, never really caught on. Can you imagine trying to get that through airport security? A quirky tidbit is that some versions of the myth suggest the lion's hide was impervious to weapons, which makes his decision to wear it quite practical, if a little flamboyant. It was shortly after this triumph that Hercules encountered the heralds of King Erginus of Orchomenus. These heralds were on their way to Thebes to collect a tribute, a rather humiliating annual payment of 100 cows and a matching number of various other livestock, which Thebes had been forced to pay after losing a war. This tribute was a bitter pill for the Thebans, a constant reminder of their defeat. Hercules, witnessing this indignity, was outraged. His sense of justice, even at this early stage, was fiercely developed. He wasn't just strong, He had a strong moral compass too, even if it occasionally pointed towards strangling things. In a fit of righteous fury, Hercules attacked the heralds, mutilating them severely, cutting off their ears, noses, and hands, and then sending them back to Erginus, mockingly instructing the king that this was the tribute he would now receive from Thebes. Talk about sending a message. This act, while undeniably violent, showed his fierce loyalty and protective instincts towards his adoptive city. Erginus, understandably enraged by this gruesome message, declared war on Thebes. However, Hercules, leading the Theban army, utterly routed Erginus's forces. In the battle, he displayed incredible martial prowess, single-handedly turning the tide. He even managed to kill Erginus himself. As a result, Thebes was not only freed from the humiliating tribute, but also imposed its own tribute on Orchomenus, doubling the original payment. It was a complete reversal of fortunes, all thanks to Hercules. Historians still argue whether this early display of uncontrolled rage foreshadowed his later, more tragic outbursts, or if it was simply a justified response to an oppressive king. As a reward for his heroic actions in defending Thebes, Creon, the king of Thebes, offered Hercules his daughter, Megara, in marriage. You might think, finally, some peace and quiet, a nice domestic life for our hero. And for a time, it seemed that way. Hercules and Megara had several children, and for a brief, blissful period, Hercules experienced something akin to normal family life. He was a hero, a husband, a father, a settled man, for all intents and purposes. But the gods, particularly Hera, were never going to let that last. This fleeting period of domestic tranquility is often overlooked, but it's important for contrasting with the sheer devastation that was to come, a calm before the ultimate storm. The peace, like a fragile teacup, was about to be shattered by divine malice. And as you imagine this brief respite in his otherwise tumultuous life, perhaps your own mind finds a quiet moment before the next wave of the story crashes over it. You might think that after achieving great victories and finding domestic bliss, Hercules would finally catch a break. But alas, dear listener, the fates, and more specifically Hera, had other, far more cruel plans in store. Remember that simmering resentment Hera harbored for Hercules, a burning jealousy that stemmed from his very conception? Well, it was about to erupt in a cataclysmic fashion. This wasn't just a petty squabble anymore. This was divine wrath unleashed with terrifying precision. You can almost feel the air growing heavy, the sudden drop in temperature, as if a storm cloud made of pure malice was descending upon Hercules' home. One day, while Hercules was in Thebes, enjoying what little peace he had with Megara and their children, Hera struck. She afflicted him with a terrible fit of madness, a blinding rage that completely consumed his mind, warping his perceptions and twisting his love into a monstrous fury. This wasn't a slow build-up of anger. It was an instant, overwhelming tide of insanity, washing over him like a tsunami. He became utterly convinced, in his delusion, that his own children were not his beloved offspring, but rather monstrous enemies, perhaps the children of Eurystheus, or some other perceived threat. It's a truly chilling thought. To be overtaken by such a profound mental illness, to lose all sense of reality, and turn on those you hold dearest. The horror of it, the absolute tragedy, is almost too much to bear, even from the distant comfort of your bed. In this horrifying state of madness, Hercules, driven by an uncontrollable urge to destroy, committed an unspeakable act. He brutally murdered his own children. And not just his children, but in some accounts, he also killed Megara, his wife, or at least caused her to flee in terror. The details vary slightly in different versions of the myth, but the core tragedy remains. A beloved hero, a man of immense strength, became an unwitting instrument of horrific destruction against his own family. Imagine the screams, the chaos, the sudden, inexplicable violence. It's a moment that stains his entire legend, a stark reminder that even the greatest heroes are susceptible to the cruel whims of the gods, or perhaps to the darker corners of their own minds. This catastrophic event, the murder of his family, is a pivotal and universally recognized moment in the Hercules myth, the ultimate manifestation of Hera's hatred. It's a mainstream historical fact in his legendary biography, defining his subsequent actions. When the fit finally passed, and Hercules awoke from his horrifying delusion, he was confronted with the devastating reality of what he had done. The sight of his murdered children, the silence where their laughter once filled the home, plunged him into an abyss of despair and guilt. The weight of his actions, even though they were committed under divine influence, was crushing. He was utterly broken, a man who had lost everything because of a goddess's spite. You might picture him, a figure of immense power, now reduced to a sobbing, trembling wreck, unable to comprehend the scale of his own unwitting monstrosity. The psychological torment must have been unbearable, a wound that no amount of physical strength could heal. Historians still argue whether this madness was solely an external infliction by Hera, or if it tapped into a pre-existing capacity for rage within Hercules himself. Was he merely a puppet, or did Hera simply push him over an edge that was already there? Overcome with remorse and seeking atonement for his unspeakable crime, Hercules exiled himself from Thebes. He wandered aimlessly, a pariah haunted by his past, seeking guidance on how to cleanse himself of the blood on his hands. You can imagine him, a towering figure, now humbled and aimless, trudging through the wilderness, his lionskin cloak feeling less like a trophy and more like a shroud of guilt. His reputation, once spotless, was now irrevocably marred by the tragedy. Eventually, he sought the wisdom of the Oracle of Delphi, the most renowned prophetic sanctuary in the ancient Greek world. This was a common recourse for heroes and mortals alike when faced with overwhelming dilemmas or seeking divine guidance. You'd probably go to a therapist. He went to a priestess breathing strange fumes in a cave. When he arrived, the Pythia, the priestess of Apollo, delivered her pronouncement. Her words were not comforting, but they offered a path, however arduous, to redemption. She declared that Hercules must go to Tiryns and serve King Eurystheus for 12 years, performing whatever labors Eurystheus commanded him to do. This was the same Eurystheus, remember, whom Hera had maneuvered into being born before Hercules, thus making him Hercules' sovereign. It was a cruel twist of fate, a truly quirky tidbit of mythological bureaucracy, that his tormentor's chosen puppet would now become his master. The very man who, by divine decree, held power over him, would now dictate his penance. The oracle's decree was clear. Only through these 12 monumental labors, commanded by the man Hera had elevated, could Hercules atone for his actions and achieve purification. It was a sentence of unimaginable hardship, a path fraught with danger, designed not only to cleanse his soul, but also to serve Hera's continuing vindictiveness. So there you are, or rather, there Hercules is, standing before the sneering, rather cowardly figure of King Eurystheus. Imagine the tension. The mighty hero, brought low by grief and divine decree, forced to bend his knee to a man who, by all accounts, was quite the opposite of heroic. This wasn't some glorious quest initiated by a wise king. This was a sentence, a penance, orchestrated by a vengeful goddess and delivered by a trembling monarch. You can practically hear Eurystheus clearing his throat nervously, trying to sound authoritative while secretly quaking in his sandals at the prospect of commanding this immensely powerful, but recently insane, man. Eurystheus, under Hera's direct influence, was determined to set tasks that were not just difficult, but seemingly impossible, designed to break Hercules, or, ideally for Hera, kill him. He wanted to make sure Hercules wouldn't just pay a fine or do a bit of community service. He wanted blood, sweat, and probably a few tears. The original plan was for 10 labors, but as we'll soon see, Eurystheus got a little pedantic and ended up adding 2 more, bringing the total to the famous 12 labors of Hercules. It's a mainstream historical fact in the mythological narrative that these labors were a direct result of the oracle's decree and Hera's malice. The very first labor Eurystheus commanded was to kill the Nemean lion. This wasn't your average, run-of-the-mill big cat. This lion was a monstrous beast, larger than any seen before, with a hide so thick it was impervious to all weapons. Swords shattered against its skin, arrows simply bounced off. It terrorized the region of Nemea, snatching livestock and villagers alike. You can just picture the fear in the eyes of the locals, the silent dread that permeated the air. Hercules set off, armed with his bow and arrows, and perhaps a vague sense of dread. When he found the lion, in its lair within a cave with 2 entrances, he tried his usual tactics. He fired arrows at it, but they merely clattered harmlessly against its impenetrable hide. Imagine his frustration, a hero renowned for his strength, now facing an enemy that simply shrugged off his best efforts. It was like trying to punch a brick wall, unsatisfying and potentially painful. Realizing his conventional weapons were useless, Hercules decided to tackle the beast the old-fashioned way, with his bare hands. He blocked one of the cave entrances, trapping the lion, and then cornered it inside. A wrestling match of epic proportions ensued within the dark confines of the cave, a struggle of raw power against savage strength. Hercules, using his immense might, managed to stun the lion by crushing its head against his own body, and then, with an incredible effort, he strangled it to death. It's a quirky tidbit that some accounts say he literally snapped its neck. Afterwards, he used one of the lion's own claws to skin the beast, creating the iconic lion skin cloak that would become his signature attire, making him not just formidable, but also fashionably impervious. Fresh off this triumph, Eurystheus had another delightful challenge waiting, the Lernaean Hydra. This was a truly formidable monster, a multi-headed serpent that lived in the swamps of Lerna. The really annoying thing about this Hydra was its regenerative ability. For every head you cut off, 2 more would grow back in its place. Imagine playing whack-a-mole, but the moles are venomous, and they multiply. Not exactly a relaxing way to spend your Tuesday. The Hydra also had a single immortal head, which made the whole endeavor even more complicated, as if a creature with 9 rapidly regrowing heads wasn't enough. Hercules, perhaps having learned his lesson about going in solo against seemingly invincible monsters, wisely brought his nephew, Iolaus, along for this particular gig. This was a smart move, and it's a testament to Hercules' growing strategic thinking rather than just brute force. You might think, why didn't he bring help for the lion? Well, live and learn, right? As Hercules battled the monstrous serpent, hacking off heads with his sword, Iolaus followed close behind, cauterizing the stumps with a burning torch to prevent them from regenerating. It was a gruesome, coordinated effort, the hiss of the Hydra's blood meeting the sizzle of the flames. This teamwork was crucial, illustrating that even demigods sometimes need a helping hand, or in this case, a nephew with a flaming stick. Historians still argue whether Iolaus' assistance constituted outside help, thereby nullifying the labor in Eurystheus' eyes, leading to an extra labor later on. Eurystheus, ever the stickler for rules, especially when they disadvantaged Hercules, eventually declared this labor void because of Iolaus' help, which just goes to show how petty these mythological kings could be. Finally, after what must have been an exhausting, slimy battle, Hercules dealt with the immortal head. He severed it, and then, to ensure it couldn't regenerate or cause any more trouble, he buried it deep under a massive rock. He then dipped his arrows in the Hydra's potent venom, making them instantly lethal, a rather handy upgrade for future monster-slaying endeavors. This detail explains how he later poisoned many other creatures and even some people, including himself, quite accidentally, later down the line. It's a bit like upgrading your weapon in a video game, but with much more toxic consequences. And as you picture Hercules, covered in grime and Hydra ichor, dipping his arrows, you can almost feel the sticky, unpleasant residue, making your own eyelids feel heavy with the weight of his endless tasks. With 2 monstrous tasks down, you might hope that Eurystheus would lighten up, but you'd be sorely mistaken. Remember, this king was merely a puppet for Hera's unending vendetta, and her spite knew no bounds. Eurystheus, still smarting from the Hydra technically being defeated with help, decided to pick something that required not just brute strength, but also immense patience and cunning. His next command was to capture the Ceryneian hind. Now, you're probably thinking, a deer? That doesn't sound so bad. But this wasn't just any deer. The Ceryneian hind was a truly magnificent creature, a female deer with golden antlers and hooves of brass, sacred to Artemis, the goddess of the hunt. Imagine a deer that looked like it belonged on the cover of a high fantasy novel, not scampering through a forest. It was incredibly swift, faster than any arrow, and virtually impossible to catch. More importantly, Artemis was fiercely protective of her sacred animals, and harming one would incur her considerable wrath, something even Hercules would want to avoid. This was a trap. Kill it, and incur a goddess's fury. Fail to catch it, and fail the labor. Eurystheus clearly hoped Hercules would either be gored by the hind or smited by Artemis. A truly delightful choice for a man who claimed to be a king. Hercules understood the delicate nature of this task. He couldn't simply overpower the hind. He had to capture it alive, and without harming it. So, for an entire year, he relentlessly pursued the hind across Greece, through forests, over mountains, and across rivers. You can picture him, a tireless, determined figure, constantly just out of reach of the elusive deer. It was a test of endurance and perseverance more than strength. He probably developed some truly impressive calf muscles during this chase. A mainstream historical fact in the myth is the incredible duration of this pursuit, highlighting Hercules' dedication even to the most frustrating of tasks. It's a quirky tidbit that some stories say he even chased it into the land of the Hyperboreans, a mythical region far to the north, which would have made for a truly epic vacation. Finally, after a year of relentless pursuit, he managed to corner the hind on the River Ladon. In a moment of quick thinking and remarkable precision, he either wounded it slightly with an arrow in the leg, careful not to kill it, of course, or trapped it in a net. Accounts vary, but the key is that he managed to subdue it without causing serious harm. As he was carrying the hind back to Eurystheus, he encountered Artemis and her brother Apollo. Artemis was, predictably, furious that her sacred animal had been disturbed. Hercules, ever the charmer, quickly explained his predicament, detailing Eurystheus' command and the oracle's decree. He pleaded his case, emphasizing that he was merely fulfilling his penance and would return the hind to her once the labor was complete. Artemis, perhaps swayed by his sincere plea and understanding the divine forces at play, relented. She allowed him to take the hind to Mycenae, but only on the condition that he return it immediately afterward. And so, Hercules presented the hind to a flabbergasted Eurystheus, who, no doubt, looked disappointed that Hercules hadn't been turned into a particularly angry tree. Next up was the Erymanthian boar, a colossal, ferocious wild boar that lived on Mount Erymanthus and terrorized the surrounding countryside, laying waste to crops and livestock. You're probably thinking, another animal? This is getting repetitive. But this wasn't just another boar. This one was particularly large and aggressive, a true menace to the local populace. This was more of a straightforward capture and subdue mission, but with a beast that could easily impale a man. On his way to Erymanthus, Hercules stopped to visit his friend, Pholus, a wise and hospitable centaur. Pholus, in a gesture of hospitality, opened a jar of wine for Hercules. Now, this wasn't just any wine. It was a special, ancient jar of wine, reserved for all the centaurs, meant to be opened only when all of them were gathered. You can see where this is going, can't you? The aroma of the wine, a truly intoxicating vintage, wafted across the mountainside, drawing the attention of the other centaurs, who were, shall we say, less civilized than Pholus. The centaurs, driven wild by the scent of the forbidden wine, descended upon Pholus's cave in a drunken, angry frenzy. A chaotic battle ensued between Hercules and the centaurs. It was a messy, brutish fight, with Hercules fending off dozens of half-man, half-horse creatures. During the melee, Hercules, using his poisoned arrows, remember those Hydra venom-tipped beauties, accidentally wounded his friend Pholus, and also Chiron, another wise and immortal centaur, who was an innocent bystander. Chiron, being immortal, couldn't die from the wound, but suffered excruciating, unending pain, eventually begging Zeus to release him by exchanging his immortality with Prometheus. It's a tragic, quirky tidbit that even in his victories, Hercules could cause accidental harm to those he cared about. Historians still argue whether this incident was an unavoidable consequence of his power, or if Hercules bore some responsibility for opening the wine in the first place, knowing the centaur's nature. After dispatching the rogue centaurs, Hercules finally got around to the boar. He found the beast, and, rather than engaging it in a prolonged fight, he used his incredible strength and endurance to simply chase it. He pursued the boar through deep snow until the animal, exhausted and bogged down, collapsed. Hercules then captured it alive, binding it with chains, and carried it, grunting and snorting, back to Eurystheus in Mycenae. Imagine the king's face when Hercules walked in, a massive, snorting boar slung over his shoulder, likely leaving a trail of mud and disgruntled wildlife behind him. Eurystheus, reportedly, was so terrified at the sight of the live boar that he leapt into a large bronze jar for safety, a rather undignified reaction for a king. And as you picture that absurd scene, a king hiding in a jar while a demigod parades a massive boar, perhaps you can feel your own worries receding, leaving only the quiet drone of the story to lull you to sleep. You'd think after wrestling giant boars and outsmarting sacred deer, Eurystheus would run out of ideas for creatively difficult tasks. But no, the well of Hera's spite, channeled through her spineless king, proved to be bottomless. For his fifth labor, Hercules was given a truly unpleasant task: to clean the Augean stables. And trust me, this wasn't just tidying up a dusty barn after a few horses. King Augeas, ruler of Elis, was famously wealthy, owning immense herds of cattle. But he was also notoriously negligent when it came to hygiene. His stables, which housed thousands of oxen, hadn't been cleaned in 30 years. Imagine, for a moment, the sheer volume of accumulated organic matter. The stench alone must have been legendary, a miasma that likely clung to the very air for miles around. You can practically feel the thick, cloying smell, the sticky, deep layers of dung, making your nose wrinkle even through the centuries. It was a mainstream historical fact in the myth that the stable's filth was unparalleled. Eurystheus, no doubt chuckling to himself, believed this task was impossible for Hercules, not because it required brute strength, but because it was so utterly disgusting and time-consuming. He likely also thought it would humiliate the great hero, covering him in literal muck. Hercules, upon seeing the truly monumental scale of the filth, quickly realized that conventional methods, a shovel and a wheelbarrow, simply wouldn't cut it. This wasn't a job for a broom, it was a job for hydrology. He proposed to Augeas that he could clean the stables in a single day, but only if he received a tenth of the king's vast herds as payment. Augeas, skeptical but intrigued, agreed, probably thinking Hercules was either mad or incredibly arrogant. So, Hercules, with a flash of ingenuity that probably surprised even himself, diverted the courses of two nearby rivers, the Alpheus and the Punnius. He then broke holes in the stable walls, directing the mighty currents through the enclosures. The rivers, roaring and churning, swept through the decades of accumulated waste, effectively flushing the entire stable clean in a matter of hours. It was an astonishing feat of engineering, albeit a rather messy one. Imagine the torrent of water, carrying away centuries of grime, leaving behind pristine, or at least much cleaner, stables. It's a quirky tidbit that this particular labor often highlights Hercules' cleverness rather than just his brawn, demonstrating that even strong men can be strategic thinkers. Historians still argue whether this act of hydraulic engineering was truly beyond mortal capabilities or an exaggerated depiction of ancient ingenuity. However, when Augeas learned that Hercules had been commanded by Eurystheus to perform this labor, he reneged on his promise of payment, claiming that Hercules was merely fulfilling his servitude and didn't deserve a reward. To make matters worse, Eurystheus, ever the stickler for rules, especially when it allowed him to deny Hercules credit, declared this labor void because Hercules had demanded payment for it. So, despite performing an incredible feat of environmental remediation, Hercules received no official credit from his tormentor. No good deed, or rather, no monstrously smelly deed, goes unpunished when Hera's involved. The sixth labor Eurystheus devised was another particularly bothersome one: to drive away the Stymphalian birds. These weren't your friendly neighborhood pigeons. These were man-eating birds with beaks of bronze, sharp metallic claws, and feathers that they could shoot like arrows. They infested the marshy lands around Lake Stymphalia, ravaging the countryside and striking terror into the hearts of the local populace. Imagine trying to have a picnic with these things circling overhead. It would be less relaxing and more like a tactical survival exercise. You'd need more than a simple scarecrow to deal with these airborne nuisances. Hercules arrived at Lake Stymphalia and quickly realized that he couldn't simply fight these birds head-on. There were too many of them, and their metallic feathers made them dangerous from a distance. Plus, the dense foliage and swampy terrain made it impossible to flush them out effectively. He needed a way to get them airborne, where he could deal with them more easily. Once again, divine intervention, albeit a friendly kind this time, came to his aid. Athena, ever the pragmatic goddess, appeared to Hercules and provided him with a pair of bronze rattles, or crotala, crafted by Hephaestus, the god of the forge. These weren't your typical baby toys. These were massive, clanging instruments, capable of producing an ear-splitting racket. You can almost feel the jarring vibration as he shook them. Hercules climbed a nearby mountain overlooking the lake and began to loudly clatter the bronze rattles. The deafening noise, a truly unholy cacophony, startled the birds into the air. They rose in a massive, screeching flock, startled and disoriented by the unbearable sound. As they flew into the sky, Hercules used his bow and his trusty hydrovenom-tipped arrows to shoot them down. He didn't manage to kill all of them, but he drove the vast majority away, forcing them to flee the region. Some accounts say they flew all the way to the Black Sea, never to return. It's a satisfying image, a hero using noise pollution to solve a monster problem. This particular labor is a great example of Hercules using cleverness and specific tools, rather than just raw brawn. And as you picture the metallic birds scattering into the distant sky, leaving behind a newfound quiet, perhaps your own thoughts can scatter, leaving only the calm of sleep. You'd think after cleaning out a 30-year stable and inventing noise warfare against metal birds, Eurystheus might be running low on creative tortures for Hercules. But no, the well of mythical misery, seemingly, had no bottom. For his seventh labor, Eurystheus decided to send Hercules off the Greek mainland entirely, to the island of Crete, to deal with the Cretan bull. This wasn't some gentle beast of burden. This was a magnificent, incredibly powerful bull, a shimmering white animal that possessed immense strength and a fiery temperament. You can practically hear its snorts, feel the tremor of its hooves as it rampaged through the fields. Now, this bull had quite the backstory. It was originally sent by Poseidon, the god of the sea, to King Minos of Crete, either as a gift or for sacrifice, depending on which version of the myth you're reading. Minos, however, found the bull so beautiful that he decided to keep it for himself, sacrificing a lesser bull instead. This, predictably, angered Poseidon, who then caused the bull to go wild, ravaging the Cretan countryside, breathing fire in some accounts, generally making a nuisance of itself. So, Hercules' task was not to kill it, but to capture it alive and bring it back to Eurystheus. This required incredible strength and skill, as subduing such a powerful animal without killing it is no easy feat. It's a mainstream historical fact that this bull was associated with King Minos and Poseidon's wrath. Hercules traveled to Crete, where he was met by King Minos. Minos, perhaps weary of the bull's destructive escapades, or simply intrigued by the prospect of someone else handling his divine problem, readily offered Hercules assistance in capturing the beast. However, Hercules, in typical hero fashion, preferred to tackle the challenge alone. He tracked the bull, cornered it, and after a prolonged and undoubtedly exhausting struggle, managed to subdue it. Imagine wrestling a creature that size, its muscles rippling, its horns threatening. He didn't use nets or tricks. He simply overpowered it with his bare hands, probably by grabbing its horns and twisting its head into submission, or perhaps a well-placed headlock. It's a quirky tidbit that some stories suggest he actually rode the bull across the sea to the Peloponnese, which would have been a rather uncomfortable, if scenic, journey. After capturing it, Hercules ferried the magnificent, albeit disgruntled, bull back to Eurystheus. Eurystheus, as usual, was terrified by the sight of the powerful animal and released it, allowing it to roam free, eventually making its way to Marathon, where it continued to cause trouble until it was finally dealt with by Theseus. For his eighth labor, Eurystheus sent Hercules to Thrace to deal with the mares of Diomedes. And yes, you guessed it, these weren't your average horses either. King Diomedes, a son of Ares, the god of war, owned a herd of 4 mares that were truly monstrous. They were kept tethered with chains of iron and fed a rather unconventional diet, human flesh. These carnivorous mares, named Podargos, Lampon, Xanthos, and Danos, meaning swift, shining, blonde, and terrible, respectively, just to give you an idea of their charm, were a terrifying menace. Imagine trying to stable animals that prefer your neighbor for dinner. The sheer barbarity of feeding human flesh to horses made this labor particularly abhorrent. You can almost hear the unsettling gnawing sounds echoing from their stalls. Hercules, accompanied by a few companions, in some accounts, Abderus, his beloved squire, which is a key detail, traveled to Thrace. He either subdued the stable hands, killed Diomedes outright, or simply drove the mares towards the sea. The accounts vary, but the result was the same: a chaotic, violent confrontation with the flesh-eating equines. In many versions of the myth, Diomedes himself came to resist Hercules, leading to a fierce battle. Hercules, naturally, defeated and killed Diomedes, and in a gruesome act of poetic justice, fed the tyrannical king to his own mares. This, unsurprisingly, calmed the mares down, making them surprisingly docile after their meal. A quirky tidbit: some say this act broke them of their taste for human flesh entirely, turning them into normal, if still very powerful, horses. However, the labor wasn't without its own tragedy. During the chaos of trying to wrangle the mares, Abderus, Hercules' beloved companion, was tragically killed. In some versions, he was left to guard the mares and was devoured by them. In others, he was simply trampled during the struggle. Hercules was deeply grieved by the loss of his friend. He founded the city of Abdera near the spot where his companion died, honoring his memory. This act of founding a city in sorrow shows a more tender, human side of Hercules, a stark contrast to his usual displays of brute force. Historians still argue whether the loss of Abderus was an accidental tragedy or an intentional part of Hera's scheme, further adding emotional pain to Hercules' physical trials. After calming the mares and making them docile, Hercules brought them back to Eurystheus. Predictably, Eurystheus, terrified by the sheer power and reputation of the mares, refused to keep them. He either released them, allowing them to wander freely around Argos, where they eventually met a natural, non-flesh-eating death, or he dedicated them to Hera. Either way, they were no longer Hercules' problem, which was probably a huge relief. And as you imagine those powerful, formerly man-eating horses, now subdued and calm, perhaps you can feel a similar calm settling over your own thoughts as the story continues to quietly unfold. Having dealt with the monstrous and the merely disgusting, Hercules now faced two labors that would take him to the very fringes of the known world, testing not just his strength, but his resolve to travel immense distances. You're probably thinking, surely, he's done with animals for a bit. Not quite, but at least these next ones involve some interesting human, or demi-human, interaction. For his ninth labor, Eurystheus commanded Hercules to acquire the girdle of Hippolyta, the queen of the Amazons. The Amazons were a formidable tribe of warrior women, rumored to live somewhere far to the east, near the Black Sea. They were fierce, independent, and renowned for their martial prowess. Imagine a society entirely run by formidable female warriors. It was quite a novel concept for the ancient Greek mind, and perhaps still for some even today. The girdle itself was a symbol of Hippolyta's authority and position as queen, a magnificent belt gifted to her by Ares, the god of war. Eurystheus' daughter, Admete, apparently coveted this girdle, prompting her father to send Hercules on this rather fashionable quest. It's a mainstream historical fact that the Amazons were a popular subject in Greek mythology, often depicted as both fearsome and fascinating. Hercules set off, accompanied by a small band of companions, including the hero Theseus, who, in some versions, gets his own side adventure involving kidnapping an Amazon queen, Antiope or Hippolyta herself, which is a whole other story. When they arrived at the Amazonian capital, Themyscira, Hippolyta, surprisingly, greeted Hercules with hospitality. She had heard of his great deeds and reputation, and she was so impressed that she readily agreed to give him the girdle. You might think, well, that was easy, and it should have been. But, as with all things in Hercules' life, Hera simply couldn't allow a peaceful resolution. Disguising herself as an Amazonian warrior, Hera spread rumors among the Amazon ranks that Hercules intended to kidnap Hippolyta. This, predictably, stirred up the proud and wary Amazons, leading them to believe they were under attack. The result was a fierce and bloody battle, entirely orchestrated by Hera's malice. Hercules, caught off guard by the sudden hostility, believed that Hippolyta had betrayed him. In the ensuing chaos, he tragically killed Hippolyta and seized the girdle by force. Imagine the sudden shift from diplomacy to brutal combat, all because of one jealous goddess. It's a truly quirky tidbit that a seemingly peaceful mission devolved into violence solely due to divine interference. Historians still argue whether Hippolyta's death was always part of the original myth or a later addition to emphasize Hera's relentless persecution. Having secured the girdle, at a tragic cost, Hercules made his way back to Eurystheus, presenting the coveted item. Eurystheus, no doubt disappointed that Hercules hadn't died, probably just snatched the girdle and dismissed him. His 10th labor was arguably the most geographically ambitious yet, to obtain the cattle of Geryon. This involved an epic journey to the far west, to the mythical island of Erythea, which literally means Red Island, often associated with sunsets and the western edge of the world. Geryon was a fearsome monster, a triple-bodied, triple-headed giant, born from the union of Chrysaor and Callirrhoe. Imagine trying to dress that guy in a sweater. 3 heads, 3 torsos, 6 arms, 6 legs. It's a lot to keep track of. Geryon owned a magnificent herd of red cattle, guarded by the monstrous 2-headed dog Orthrus, brother of Cerberus, just to keep it in the family, and the herdsman Eurytion. The journey itself was a monumental undertaking. Hercules had to travel through vast deserts, enduring intense heat. At one point, frustrated by the scorching sun, he even shot an arrow at Helios, the sun god. Helios, rather than being offended, was apparently so impressed by Hercules' audacity that he lent him his golden cup, which was actually a giant boat, to sail across the ocean to Erythea. It's a quirky tidbit that even a god, when faced with Hercules' sheer stubbornness, might just decide to help him out. Upon arriving at Erythea, Hercules immediately confronted Orthrus, the 2-headed dog, and killed him with a single blow of his club. He then dispatched Eurytion, the herdsman, quickly and efficiently. Geryon, alerted by the commotion, rushed to protect his cattle. What followed was a colossal battle between the multi-bodied giant and the mighty hero. Hercules, despite facing such an unusual and formidable opponent, eventually triumphed, striking Geryon down with his arrows, or in some accounts, with his club. Imagine the sheer effort required to take down a being with 3 separate centers of gravity. Once Geryon was defeated, Hercules began the arduous task of herding the vast number of cattle back to Mycenae. This wasn't a simple stroll through the park. The return journey was fraught with challenges, including crossing deserts, rivers, and even fending off various attacks from local tribes who tried to steal the cattle. At one point, he famously created the Pillars of Hercules, the Strait of Gibraltar, to commemorate his journey, separating the continents of Europe and Africa, marking the edge of the known world. It's a mainstream geographical detail often attributed to him. He finally arrived back in Mycenae, cattle in tow, having completed another seemingly impossible labor. Eurystheus, as was his custom, sacrificed the cattle to Hera, no doubt hoping to appease her, even as Hercules continued to defy her schemes. And as you picture Hercules, dusty and weary, guiding a vast herd of red cattle across ancient landscapes, perhaps your own journey into sleep becomes a little more certain, following the path of this tireless hero. You followed Hercules across continents, witnessed him tame beasts and outweak goddesses, but now, for his 11th labor, he faced a task that touched upon the divine itself, retrieving the apples of the Hesperides. These weren't just any apples, they were golden apples, symbols of immortality, growth, and eternal youth. They grew in a sacred garden at the western edge of the world, guarded by the Hesperides, nymphs of the evening, and a fearsome, 100-headed dragon named Ladon, who never slept. Imagine a garden bathed in perpetual twilight, shimmering with the soft glow of golden fruit, and guarded by a creature that's basically a living, breathing security system with way too many heads. It's a mainstream historical fact that these apples were associated with Hera, given to her as a wedding gift. The exact location of the Hesperides garden was a closely guarded secret, known only to the gods. This meant Hercules had no idea where he was going. You can picture him, rather aimlessly wandering, perhaps muttering about GPS not being invented yet. This lack of direction led to a series of encounters and many adventures. He journeyed through North Africa, battling various tribes and brigands along the way. He even encountered the giant Antaeus, son of Poseidon and Gaia, who gained his strength from contact with the earth. Hercules, realizing this, lifted Antaeus off the ground and crushed him in a bear hug, a rather unique way to win a wrestling match. His most significant encounter on this journey was with Prometheus, the Titan who had been eternally chained to a rock for giving fire to humanity. Prometheus, in exchange for being freed from his torment, which Hercules promptly did by killing the eagle that gnawed at his liver, advised Hercules not to pluck the apples himself. Instead, he told Hercules to seek out Atlas, the Titan condemned to hold up the sky on his shoulders. This piece of advice was crucial, and a prime example of strategic thinking entering Hercules' typically more direct approach. It's a quirky tidbit that a prophecy or divine guidance often played a key role in the success of these seemingly impossible tasks. Hercules found Atlas, burdened by the heavens, and made him an offer. He proposed that he would temporarily take on the immense burden of holding the sky, if Atlas would retrieve the golden apples from his daughters, the Hesperides. Atlas, eager for even a brief respite from his eternal punishment, agreed. Imagine the weight of the cosmos settling onto Hercules' shoulders, the sheer, crushing pressure. It was a monumental feat of strength, requiring every ounce of his demigod power. Atlas, having secured the apples, returned, and perhaps seeing a golden opportunity to shed his burden permanently, declared that he would deliver the apples himself and leave Hercules to hold the sky forever. You can almost hear the smugness in his voice. But Hercules, always quick-witted despite his brawn, wasn't about to be outsmarted. He feigned agreement, asking Atlas to take the sky back for just a moment so Hercules could adjust his lion-skin cloak, which was apparently bunching up. Atlas, falling for the trick, briefly took the sky back. The moment he did, Hercules snatched the golden apples and, without a word, walked away, leaving Atlas once again burdened with his eternal punishment. Talk about a mic drop moment. Historians still argue whether this act was genuinely clever or a momentary lapse in Atlas's judgment, given his long torment. With the golden apples secured, Hercules returned to Eurystheus, who, as usual, was terrified of these unusual gifts. He reportedly dedicated them to Athena, who, being a goddess of wisdom, probably knew exactly what to do with immortal fruit. Now, for his 12th and final labor, Eurystheus saved the absolute worst for last, to bring back Cerberus, the three-headed dog that guarded the entrance to the underworld. You're probably thinking, okay, that's impossible. And you'd be right, for any mortal. This wasn't just a monster hunt. This was a journey into the realm of the dead itself, a place where no living mortal was meant to go and return from. Imagine descending into the deep, dark earth, knowing that every step takes you further from the living world, closer to the shadowy domain of Hades. It's a mainstream historical fact that Cerberus was the guardian of the underworld, a central figure in Greek eschatology. Before embarking on this perilous journey, Hercules wisely sought initiation into the Eleusinian Mysteries, a secret religious cult dedicated to Demeter and Persephone. This initiation was believed to grant safe passage through the underworld and purify individuals, which was probably a good idea before tangling with death dogs. It's a quirky tidbit that even the most powerful heroes often sought spiritual guidance before facing such profound challenges. Once purified, Hercules descended into the underworld, guided by Hermes, the messenger of the gods, and Athena. This journey itself was filled with encounters with various shades of the dead, including Meleager, and even Hades himself. When he finally reached the palace of Hades, he found Cerberus, a monstrous hound with 3 heads, though some accounts give him 50 or even 100, a mane of snakes, and a serpent's tail, guarding the gates of the dead. Hercules approached Hades and Persephone, respectfully asking for permission to take Cerberus to the surface. Hades, either impressed by Hercules' bravery or perhaps simply amused by the audacity of a living man in his realm, agreed, but only on one condition. Hercules had to subdue Cerberus without using any weapons, relying solely on his physical strength. What followed was a titanic struggle between Hercules and the terrifying guardian of the dead. Hercules, protected by his lion-skin cloak, wrestled the monstrous dog, enduring its bites and the venom of its snake-like mane. He finally managed to get a chokehold around Cerberus's central neck, squeezing with all his might until the monstrous dog, gagging and panting, finally succumbed. He didn't kill it, just subdued it. A truly remarkable feat. Imagine trying to get a leash on that thing. Historians still argue whether this task was a symbolic triumph over death itself, or simply the ultimate test of physical and mental endurance. Having successfully subdued Cerberus, Hercules dragged the beast, snarling and drooling venom, out of the underworld and up to the world of the living. The sight of Cerberus, brought blinking into the sunlight, apparently terrified Eurystheus so much that he immediately commanded Hercules to take the beast back to the underworld. And with that final, terrifying display, Hercules had completed all 12 of his labors, his penance. You've witnessed Hercules complete his impossible labors, a grueling saga of monster slaying and divine manipulation. You might imagine that, having paid his penance and cleansed his soul, he'd settle down, perhaps open a small, quaint inn. But dear listener, the life of a demigod isn't that simple. The gods, particularly Hera, were never truly done with him, and his own tempestuous nature often led him into further complications. His post-labor life was a series of continued adventures, both self-inflicted and divinely orchestrated, proving that even a hero's retirement plans are usually pretty chaotic. After the labors, Hercules briefly returned to Thebes, now a free man from Eurystheus' tyranny. However, his previous marriage to Megara had ended in tragedy, so he sought a new wife. He entered an archery contest, the prize being Iole, the beautiful daughter of King Eurytus of Oechalia. Hercules won the contest fairly, proving his unmatched skill. However, Eurytus, perhaps remembering Hercules' past madness or simply fearing his volatile nature, refused to give him his daughter. This rejection deeply offended Hercules, who felt his honor was slighted. He even tried to steal Eurydice' cattle in a fit of pique, which is a rather unheroic response to a wedding snub, if you ask me. This refusal and subsequent cattle theft is a mainstream historical fact in the myths detailing his later life, showing his continued struggle with impulse control. Around this time, Hercules was again afflicted by a fit of madness, though less severe than the one that led him to kill his family. In this bout of delusion, he killed Iphitus, Eurydice' son and a friend of Hercules, by throwing him off a cliff. This accidental killing, yet another unintended consequence of his volatile temper, plunged him back into guilt and compelled him to seek purification once more. You'd think by now he'd have a therapist on speed dial, but no, it was always the oracle or some other grand gesture. Seeking atonement for Iphitus' death, Hercules consulted the oracle of Delphi again. This time, the Pythia refused to give him a prophecy, angered by his past actions. In a classic Hercules move, he attempted to steal the Delphic tripod, the sacred seat from which the oracle delivered her prophecies, intending to set up his own oracle. This, predictably, led to a wrestling match with Apollo himself. Imagine that, a god and a demigod brawling over a piece of sacred furniture. Zeus, intervening to prevent further chaos, separated them with a thunderbolt. Eventually, the oracle relented and decreed that Hercules must be sold into slavery for a year and his price, given to Eurydice as compensation for his son's death. This was a truly humiliating punishment for a hero of his stature, to be reduced to a chattel. Thus, Hercules was purchased by Omphale, the wealthy and powerful queen of Lydia, a region in Asia Minor. This period of his life, his servitude to Omphale, is one of the more unusual and often humorously depicted episodes in his legend. Instead of battling monsters, Hercules found himself performing domestic tasks and, famously, wearing women's clothing while Omphale wore his lion-skin cloak and wielded his club. You can picture the absurdity. The mighty hero, known for his masculine prowess, now spinning wool or fanning Omphale with a peacock feather, all while wearing silk and jewelry. It's a truly quirky tidbit that this role reversal, designed to humble him, has been interpreted in many ways, from a symbolic castration to a period of genuine spiritual purification through submission. Historians still argue whether this was a literal account or a metaphorical representation of his emotional state. Despite the seemingly emasculating nature of his servitude, Hercules still managed to perform heroic deeds during his time with Omphale. He continued to rid Lydia of various bandits and monsters, albeit perhaps with a bit more glitter than usual. He captured the Cercopes, mischievous thieving dwarfs, by hanging them upside down from a pole he carried on his shoulders, an image that must have been quite a sight. He also slew Silius, who forced passers-by to hoe his vineyard, and dealt with a giant serpent in the river Sangarius. So, even in domestic servitude, the hero couldn't entirely shed his heroic responsibilities. It's almost as if monsters just instinctively knew where he was and decided to cause trouble. After his year of servitude was complete, Hercules was finally freed from his bond to Omphale. This period of humbling submission was meant to purge him of his hubris and his tendency towards uncontrolled rage, a kind of mythological behavioral therapy. While he certainly performed heroics, the core of this labor was about learning humility and patience. He had been a slave, had dressed as a woman, and had endured a year of being ordered around by a queen. It was a stark contrast to his usual role as the all-conquering, independent hero. And as you picture the mighty Hercules, finally shedding his silken robes and reclaiming his lion skin, perhaps you can feel the easing of your own tensions, settling into the long, quiet night. You've seen Hercules endure humiliation and perform a stint of domestic heroism. But the universe, or rather, the eternally scheming Hera, wasn't quite done with testing his capacity for suffering. His final and most tragic chapter begins, as many do, with a new love, only to be irrevocably intertwined with an old, familiar nemesis, the centaur. After his servitude to Omphale, Hercules found himself drawn to the family of Enyeus, the king of Calydon. He sought the hand of Deianira, Enyeus' beautiful daughter. Now, Deianira was already promised to the river god Hercules, who had the ability to change his form. So, naturally, Hercules had to wrestle a river god for his bride. Imagine grappling with a being that can turn into a snake, then a bull, then back into a man. It's certainly more complicated than your average engagement party. Hercules, with his usual tenacity, defeated Hercules, breaking off one of his horns, which became the mythical cornucopia, a symbol of abundance, a rather quirky tidbit to come from a marital dispute. Having won her hand, Hercules married Deianira. You might think, finally, a peaceful union. But remember, this is Hercules, and peace is merely the calm before the next, even more devastating, storm. Their journey together, however, was soon interrupted by a fateful encounter with a familiar type of creature, a centaur. As Hercules and Deianira traveled, they came to the river Euenus, which was swollen and difficult to cross. A centaur named Nessus offered to carry Deianira across the treacherous waters, while Hercules swam. Now, Nessus wasn't just a ferryman. He was a rather unsavory character, known for his lecherous nature. As he carried Deianira, he became overcome with lust and attempted to abduct or assault her. You can imagine Deianira's terrified cries echoing across the river. Hercules, ever vigilant and quick to anger, heard her distress. Without a moment's hesitation, he drew his bow and fired one of his hydrovenom-tipped arrows straight into Nessus's chest. The centaur, mortally wounded, staggered back to the riverbank. This arrow, remember, was coated in the potent, agonizing venom of the Lernaean hydra, a substance that brought unimaginable pain and death to anyone it touched. It's a mainstream historical fact that Hercules' hydra-poisoned arrows were a recurring element in his later stories, often with tragic consequences. As Nessus lay dying, however, he decided to enact one last, cruel act of revenge. With his dying breath, he whispered to Deianira, telling her to collect some of his blood, claiming it was a potent love charm. He told her that if Hercules ever wavered in his affection, a cloak soaked in this blood would ensure his faithfulness forever. Deianira, innocent and desperate to secure her husband's love, believed him. She collected some of the blood, which, unknown to her, was now saturated with the deadly hydra venom from Hercules' arrow. This, dear listener, is the ultimate gift that keeps on taking, a truly horrific piece of mythological foreshadowing. It's a quirky tidbit that this act of deceit was committed by a dying centaur, proving that even in their final moments, some villains still have tricks up their sleeves. Historians still argue whether Deianira's subsequent actions were born of genuine love and naivete or a subtle, darker jealousy. Years passed, and Hercules continued his heroic endeavors, but his loyalty, or perhaps his eye, occasionally wandered. He fell in love with Iole, the daughter of King Eurytus, the very king who had previously denied him her hand and whom Hercules had subsequently killed. He even took Iole captive. News of Hercules' renewed affection for Iole reached Deianira. She was heartbroken and consumed by fear that she would lose her husband's love to this younger woman. Remembering Nessus's dying words, and desperate to rekindle Hercules' affection and ensure his fidelity, Deianira decided to use the love charm. She soaked a magnificent robe, often referred to as the robe of Nessus or the shirt of Nessus, in the centaur's venomous blood, and sent it to Hercules, who was preparing for a public sacrifice and celebration. She intended it as a gesture of love, a way to bind him to her forever. Hercules put on the robe. The moment the poisoned fabric touched his skin, the hydra venom, activated by his body heat, began to burn him with excruciating, unimaginable agony. It wasn't just a rash. It was as if 1,000 venomous snakes were gnawing at his flesh from the inside out. The pain was so intense that it drove him to madness, the same kind of destructive rage that had led him to kill his children. He tried to tear the robe off, but it clung to his flesh, ripping away skin and muscle with every desperate tug. The very essence of his being was being consumed by the burning poison. You can almost feel the searing heat, the agonizing pull of the fabric against his flesh, a truly gruesome end for a hero. This is a crucial, defining moment, as it directly links back to the Hydra labor, showing how even a past victory could lead to a future tragedy. You've just witnessed Hercules engulfed in unimaginable agony, the Hydra's venom, a product of his own heroic deeds, consuming him from within. This wasn't a quick, merciful death. It was a prolonged, excruciating torment, a final, horrifying act of Hera's relentless spite. Imagine every nerve ending screaming, every muscle fiber burning, as the poison, hot as molten lead, fused the robe to his very flesh. The pain drove him to an uncontrollable frenzy. He tried to tear the agonizing garment from his body, but each desperate pull ripped away chunks of his skin and muscle, exposing bone. He collapsed to the ground, thrashing, screaming, his once invincible strength now turned into an instrument of self-destruction. In his delirium, still consumed by the agonizing pain, Hercules lashed out at anyone near him. One unfortunate individual, Lycus, who had brought him the poisoned robe, though unknowingly, was seized by the tormented hero. In a fit of venom-induced rage, Hercules hurled Lycus high into the air. The hapless messenger either plunged into the sea, becoming a rock formation, or was dashed against the mountainside, a stark and tragic casualty of the hero's final, involuntary rampage. This violent, unintended death of Lycus is a poignant, if gruesome, detail, often recounted in the various versions of Hercules' demise. It's a mainstream historical fact in the mythological narrative that his final moments were marked by uncontrollable agony and accidental violence. As the venom continued its work, Hercules, still alive but suffering beyond endurance, realized his end was near. He commanded his companions, including his son Hylas, to build a great pyre on Mount Ida. You can picture the solemn procession, the hero, once the epitome of strength, now a ravaged shell, being carried to his final resting place. This wasn't a hero's glorious battle. It was a slow, agonizing surrender to an invisible enemy, a quiet, horrifying fate. It was a conscious choice, a decision to escape the torment that gripped him. He demanded that no one, not even his own son, light the pyre. Finally, Philoctetes, a shepherd, or in some accounts, his son Pous, was persuaded to light the pyre. In exchange for this grim service, Hercules bequeathed him his bow and his famed hydrovenom-tipped arrows, instruments that would later play a crucial role in the Trojan War. This transfer of his legendary weapons is a significant detail, linking his story to future heroic narratives. It's a quirky tidbit that his bow and arrows carried such immense power that they continued to influence events long after his death. Historians still argue whether Philoctetes' reluctance stemmed from fear of divine retribution or simply the horror of setting fire to a living demigod. As the flames consumed his mortal body, a miraculous transformation occurred. You can imagine the crackle of the fire, the smoke curling into the sky, and then a sudden, blinding flash of light. Zeus, his divine father, finally intervened. He sent a chariot driven by Athena to carry Hercules' essence, his divine part, to Mount Olympus. The mortal, suffering flesh of Hercules was consumed by the flames, but his immortal spirit, purified by fire and suffering, ascended to join the gods. This was Hercules' apotheosis, his elevation from demigod to full deity. He was welcomed onto Mount Olympus with great celebration. Even Hera, his lifelong tormentor, finally relented. Whether convinced by Zeus's will, or perhaps simply exhausted by her own relentless hatred, she reconciled with him. In a final, symbolic act of acceptance, Hera even gave Hercules her daughter, Hebe, the goddess of youth, as his immortal bride. Imagine the irony. The goddess who had spent centuries trying to destroy him now offered him her own child in marriage. It's a rather neat and tidy ending, considering all the chaos that preceded it. Almost too perfect, wouldn't you say? On Olympus, Hercules took his rightful place among the gods, no longer bound by mortal suffering or the whims of petty kings. He became the god of strength, heroes, athletes, and even doorways, a rather niche portfolio, but important nonetheless. He was granted eternal youth and immortality, free from the pains and sorrows of his mortal life. This transition from mortal suffering to divine glory is a mainstream historical fact in his mythology, marking the culmination of his arduous journey. And as you picture Hercules, finally at peace, perhaps enjoying an ambrosia cocktail on Olympus, maybe your own mind can find that ultimate peace, letting go of the day's worries and drifting into the quiet comfort of sleep. You've followed Hercules from his impossible birth to his glorious ascension, but the story doesn't simply end on Mount Olympus. The echoes of his life, his labors, and his complex character reverberate through centuries, shaping the way we tell stories, understand heroism, and even define strength. His legacy and cultural impact are truly immense, far outstripping the boundaries of ancient Greece. He's arguably one of the most recognizable figures from mythology, a true superstar of the ancient world whose fame continues unabated even today. You probably see references to him more often than you realize, tucked into everyday phrases or modern entertainment. Think about the sheer ubiquity of his name. Herculean effort isn't just a fancy phrase, it's a direct callback to his legendary struggles. If you describe something as requiring Herculean strength, everyone immediately understands the monumental scale of the task. This adoption of his name into common parlance is a mainstream historical fact of language, showing how deeply ingrained his myth has become. It's a linguistic fossil, a little piece of ancient history embedded in our everyday speech, reminding us of his enduring image as the ultimate strongman. His image and stories have inspired countless works of art and literature across millennia. From ancient Greek pottery and sculptures depicting his labors, showcasing his muscular physique and iconic lion-skin cloak, to Renaissance paintings that reinterpreted his struggles with classical grandeur. You can find him in the works of great playwrights like Sophocles and Euripides, whose tragedies often delved into the darker, more tormented aspects of his character, particularly his fits of madness. Imagine a play where the hero, the very symbol of virtue, suddenly descends into horrifying delusion. It's powerful, dramatic stuff. Moving forward in time, he became a favorite subject during the Baroque period, where artists delighted in depicting his dynamic battles and emotional struggles. Even in more recent centuries, poets like William Blake and Lord Byron found inspiration in his myth. He's practically a blueprint for the tragic hero, a figure whose immense power is often matched by immense suffering. It's a quirky tidbit that for all his physical prowess, artists often focused on his internal struggles, his moments of weakness and remorse, making him surprisingly relatable despite his divine origins. But his influence isn't confined to dusty museum halls or academic texts. Hercules has leaped off the pages of myth and into the vibrant world of popular culture. Think about it. How many superhero stories, particularly those centered on super strength and a noble but troubled character, owe a debt to Hercules? You see him in comic books, often as a rival or ally to other powerful figures. He's been the star of numerous Hollywood blockbusters, some attempting historical accuracy, others gleefully reimagining his tales with a healthy dose of cinematic license. From animated films aimed at children to gritty action movies, Hercules is a perennial favorite, constantly being reinvented for new audiences. You probably remember some of these adaptations from your own childhood, perhaps even hummed along to a catchy tune about his zero-to-hero journey. He's also found his way into video games, where players can embody his strength, solve puzzles related to his labors, or simply smash mythical creatures with a giant club. And if you pay attention, even in advertisements, his name or image might be subtly used to convey power, durability, or incredible performance. It's almost as if every new generation finds a way to rediscover him, to project their own ideas of heroism onto his formidable frame. The reason for this enduring appeal, historians still argue, lies in the multifaceted nature of his character. Was he a brute, prone to uncontrolled rage, or a noble hero seeking redemption? Was he a victim of divine malice, or did he possess an inherent flaw that led to his tragedies? The truth, perhaps, lies somewhere in the messy, human, or rather, demigod, middle. His story is a testament to perseverance, to overcoming impossible odds, and to the idea that even after great mistakes, there can be a path to atonement and glory. He embodies both the best and worst of what it means to be powerful, making him a complex and endlessly fascinating figure. His story provides a framework for understanding not just ancient beliefs, but timeless human struggles. The fight against external foes, the battle against one's own inner demons, and the quest for purpose and redemption. And as you consider how deeply his story has woven itself into the fabric of our culture, perhaps you can feel your own mind weaving threads of slumber, pulling you deeper into dreams. You've traveled the long, winding path of Hercules' life, from his miraculous, yet cursed, birth to his ascent among the gods. You've seen his strength, his fury, his moments of cleverness, and his profound, tragic suffering. But what is it about this hero, this figure of colossal strength and equally colossal flaws, that makes his story resonate across so many millennia? Why does he, out of all the myriad figures of Greek mythology, remain so stubbornly present in our collective consciousness? The enduring appeal of the Hercules myth, even today, lies in its remarkable blend of the divine and the deeply human. He's not just a god or a remote, perfect figure. He is, at his core, a relatable struggle. You might picture him, not as a static statue, but as a dynamic force of nature, constantly battling not only external monsters, but also his own internal demons. He grapples with fate, with divine injustice, with the consequences of his own powerful emotions. Think about the complexity. A hero who accidentally murders his family, then spends a lifetime trying to atone. That's a story that transcends simple good versus evil narratives. It delves into themes of guilt, redemption, and the search for meaning in a world that often feels arbitrary and cruel. Historians still argue whether his madness was purely divine intervention or an ancient way of describing a deep-seated psychological struggle, making him, in a strange way, incredibly modern. His story is a powerful exploration of the human condition, even though he's a demigod. He faces trials that feel insurmountable, suffers unbearable losses, and yet he perseveres. He is the ultimate underdog, even with his superhuman abilities, because the deck is constantly stacked against him by an envious goddess. You can see yourself in his moments of frustration, perhaps not with a multi-headed hydra, but with your own daily struggles that feel equally overwhelming. He is a testament to the idea that true heroism isn't about never falling, but about getting back up, no matter how many times you are knocked down. This relentless perseverance in the face of impossible odds is a mainstream historical fact of his character, deeply embedded in every labor. Furthermore, Hercules represents the raw, untamed power of nature, but also the attempt to civilize and control it. He cleanses the land of monsters, literally and figuratively, making the world safer for humanity. He's the embodiment of strength harnessed for a greater good, even when that strength occasionally spirals out of control. His journey from a reckless, hot-headed youth to a more disciplined, albeit still temperamental, hero reflects a journey of self-mastery. It's a quirky tidbit that many philosophers and thinkers throughout history have used Hercules as a metaphor for the struggle between passion and reason, between our animalistic urges and our higher selves. Ultimately, the story of Hercules is an open scholarly debate. Is he a tragic figure, forever cursed by Hera's wrath? Is he a symbol of human potential, capable of overcoming any obstacle? Or is he simply a reflection of ancient anxieties about power, fate, and the unpredictable nature of the divine? Perhaps he is all of these things, a multifaceted myth that allows each generation to find new meaning within its ancient framework. His story is a powerful reminder that even in the darkest moments, there is a path forward, however arduous. And sometimes, even just the act of listening to a story, of following a hero through his trials and triumphs, can bring a quiet sense of resolution, a peaceful certainty that allows your mind to finally rest. The journey through Hercules' world now gently draws to a close. Let the images of ancient Greece, of towering heroes and mythical beasts, slowly fade from your mind's eye. Feel the subtle hum of quiet settle over you, a calm that deepens with each gentle breath. There's no more struggle, no more grand quests, just the soft descent into peaceful darkness. Your thoughts, like distant stars, begin to twinkle and then quietly extinguish, one by one. The weight of the day, like Atlas's burden, is lifted. You are simply here, suspended in the stillness, floating effortlessly. Let your muscles soften, your eyelids grow heavy, and your breath grow long and slow. The world outside can wait. For now, there is only this quiet, this profound sense of calm, inviting you to simply let go.